For more than 40 years, Republicans promised that tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest households would produce so much investment, hiring, and economic growth that the lost revenue would practically replace itself. Cut taxes now. Growth will pay the bill later. It did not happen. Our national debt has now reached the edge of $40 trillion. But do not worry. The same Oklahoma Republicans asking voters to send them back to Washington this November have found someone to pay the bill. You. After voting for another round of debt-financed tax cuts tilted toward corporations and the wealthy, they are preparing working families for the sacrifices that follow. Less medical and nutrition assistance, pressure on Social Security and Medicare, fewer public investments, higher interest costs, and slower economic growth. They gave Oklahomans quite a sales pitch. DOGE would reduce the deficit by eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. But the Treasury numbers tell a different story. Whatever savings came from canceled contracts, employee reductions, and agency cuts were overwhelmed by increases elsewhere in the federal budget. That is not deficit reduction. It is a smaller bucket being used against a rising tide. Republicans also cut programs supporting the three foundations that determine whether a middle-class life is affordable: housing, healthcare, and education. Rather than strengthen those foundations, they told us government did not have the money. What they left out was why. They had made tax preferences for corporations and their wealthiest donors a higher priority. The national debt was not created by one president, one Congress, or one party. But measured in nominal dollars, no president has now presided over more debt accumulation than Donald Trump. The gross national debt increased by $7.805 trillion during his first term and another $3.780 trillion through August 17th of his second term. That is approximately $11.585 trillion combined, or roughly 29% of all debt accumulated since Treasury's historical series began in 1790. Trump and Oklahoma's Republican congressional delegation did not create the entire debt problem. They chose to accelerate it after the warnings had become impossible to miss. They had the budget estimates. They knew interest costs were approaching $1 trillion a year. They knew all three major credit rating agencies had downgraded the United States as concerns about the country's fiscal direction intensified. They voted for another debt-financed tax bill anyway. The federal government recorded a deficit of approximately $432 billion in July 2026, the largest July deficit on record. During the first 10 months of fiscal 2026, the deficit reached approximately $1.799 trillion. That was already more than the $1.775 trillion deficit during all 12 months of fiscal 2025, with 2 months still remaining. The president promised that tariffs would produce enormous new revenue and help repair the federal budget. During the first 10 months of the fiscal year, tariff receipts increased by only about $55 billion. Federal spending increased by approximately $309 billion. The administration's spending campaign generated headlines. Treasury's numbers tell a different story. Interest expense increased by approximately $90 billion during the first 10 months of fiscal 2026. Total federal interest costs during that period exceeded $900 billion. The federal government now spends more on interest than almost every other individual function of government. Only Social Security and Medicare remain larger. That is what critically unsustainable debt looks like, a self-reinforcing ratchet. Higher deficits require more borrowing. More borrowing requires Treasury to sell more debt. If investors demand higher yields to absorb that debt, Washington pays more interest. Higher interest payments increase the next deficit, requiring still more borrowing. The process works like a ratchet. Each turn makes the next turn more difficult and more expensive. The United States once borrowed heavily during recessions, wars, financial crises, and national emergencies. That borrowing helped prevent temporary emergencies from becoming depressions. The country had room to respond because extraordinary deficits were supposed to be temporary. Now Washington is approaching a $2 trillion annual deficit before a full recession arrives, while accumulated debt reaches $40 trillion. The fire extinguisher has already been emptied just when smoke is beginning to appear. President Trump and congressional Republicans promoted the One Big Beautiful Bill as a working families tax cut. The Congressional Budget Office reached a different conclusion in the analysis lawmakers had before the vote. CBO estimates that the enacted law will reduce federal revenue by about $4.5 trillion, reduce direct spending by nearly $1.1 trillion, and increase federal deficits by approximately $3.4 trillion between 2025 and 2034. Much of the spending reduction does not eliminate a real cost. Reductions in Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly called SNAP, shift costs toward states, hospitals, medical providers, food banks, charities, schools, communities, and struggling families. The federal cost falls because someone else is forced to absorb it. The need does not disappear. Congress simply moves the bill downstream. CBO also examined whether the legislation would create enough additional economic growth to help pay for itself. It projected a small increase in output, but nowhere near enough to replace the lost revenue. The House version increased average annual real economic growth by only about 0.04 percentage point. That is not an engine capable of paying for trillions of dollars in tax cuts. It is a rounding error carrying a very large interest bill. Every Republican member of Oklahoma's congressional delegation voted for the legislation. They were not voting in the dark. Their defense will be that the bill reduced spending and promoted growth. But CBO included the spending reductions and still projected trillions in additional deficits. CBO considered the economic effects and still found more borrowing and higher interest costs. This was not fiscal conservatism. It was trickle-down economics financed with the national credit card. When we examined this problem several weeks ago, the danger was that continued federal borrowing would put additional upward pressure on long-term interest rates. That danger is becoming visible. Federal borrowing is not the only reason. Oil prices, overseas conflicts, inflation expectations, Federal Reserve policy, global bond markets, and private borrowing for artificial intelligence data centers also matter. But America entered this period of risk already carrying enormous structural deficits. When the federal government competes with businesses and other borrowers for capital, the price of money generally rises across the economy. Higher Treasury yields do not mechanically determine mortgage rates, but they strongly influence long-term borrowing costs. When the 10-year Treasury yield remains near 4.7%, 30-year mortgage rates can remain punishingly high. At today's rates, a family's income buys considerably less house than it did only a few years ago. Sales of lower-priced homes have been especially weak while higher-priced sales held up better. First-time buyers represented only a small share of purchases, far below the level associated with a healthy market. Affluent buyers with cash, stock market gains, and accumulated home equity still have options. Younger and middle-income families dependent on wages and mortgage financing are being pushed out. The effect becomes clearer when the interest rate becomes a monthly payment. A $300,000, 30-year mortgage at 3% carries a principal and interest payment of approximately $1,265 per month. At 7%, that payment rises to approximately $1,996. That is another $731 every month, or nearly $8,800 per year, before taxes, insurance, or fees. The mortgage market is not currently experiencing another 2008 collapse. Most homeowners with low fixed-rate mortgages and accumulated equity remain in relatively strong positions. But the averages conceal warning signs. Intercontinental Exchange, better known as ICE, reported that serious delinquencies and foreclosure inventories continued rising from unusually low levels. The warning is not that housing has collapsed. It is that high rates have frozen transactions, priced out first-time buyers, and increased distress among a smaller but growing group of homeowners. Individual American Express customers have reported having their credit limits reduced, sometimes without advance warning. The broader banking evidence is more important. The Federal Reserve's July survey found that banks tightened standards for credit card loans. Consumer loan standards remained toward the tighter end of their historical ranges. Banks do not tighten credit because they have lost interest in collecting 20% annual interest. They tighten it when the risk of not being repaid rises. The latest New York Federal Reserve report does not show a new nationwide surge in consumers becoming delinquent. Aggregate delinquency was broadly stable in the first quarter of 2026, but transitions into serious mortgage delinquency increased, and the longer-term deterioration among vulnerable borrowers cannot be ignored. High food costs, insurance, property taxes, mortgage rates, and credit expenses are arriving together. The national economy has not entered a period of mass layoffs. We should not pretend that it has. But the July employment report delivered a warning. Payroll employment declined, earlier estimates were revised downward, temporary layoffs increased, and retail and financial services employment weakened. The unemployment rate remained relatively low, but labor force participation had declined. This is not yet a deep recession. It is a loss of momentum at the exact moment higher oil prices, tariffs, interest rates, and government borrowing are adding pressure. Higher oil prices can temporarily increase Oklahoma production tax revenue and improve cash flow for existing producers. But Oklahoma should not assume higher prices will recreate the drilling and employment booms of previous decades. Public producers face investor pressure to generate free cash flow, reduce debt, control costs, repurchase shares, and return money to shareholders. Longer laterals and better productivity can maintain production with fewer rigs and fewer workers. That creates a dangerous possibility for Oklahoma. Families may pay more for gasoline, transportation, food, utilities, and borrowing without receiving the full drilling, employment, and state revenue boom that once helped offset higher oil prices. At the same time, federal Medicaid and SNAP reductions shift pressure toward Oklahoma's budget, rural hospitals, food banks, schools, charities, and families. The Big Beautiful Bill did not eliminate those costs. It sent them downstream. For decades, tax cut advocates insisted America did not need to choose between lower taxes and fiscal responsibility. Growth would make the numbers work. The numbers did not work. Waste reduction alone cannot stabilize the debt. Tariffs cannot erase a structural deficit approaching $2 trillion. Eventually, arithmetic will impose the discipline politicians refuse to exercise. Some combination of spending reductions, increased revenue, slower growth, inflation, and diminished public investment. There are no painless options left. The next recession will be especially dangerous because Washington has already surrendered much of its fiscal room. Cutting spending or raising taxes during a slowdown can make the slowdown worse. But continued borrowing can push interest costs higher and weaken confidence in the country's fiscal direction. That is the final bill for trickle-down economics, the disappearing option of financing permanent tax cuts for the wealthiest with still more debt. The national debt was created by both parties over many years. But President Trump and Oklahoma's Republican congressional delegation chose to accelerate it after the warnings were clear. They were told the bill would add trillions to the deficit. They were told the spending reductions would not offset the revenue losses. They were told the promised growth would recover only a fraction of the cost. They voted for it anyway. The final stage of trickle-down economics is not wealth finally reaching working families. It is the bill for the tax cuts reaching them. The tax cuts came first. The spending cuts, higher interest costs, and eventual revenue increases came later. And the politicians who voted for the latest round are already explaining why everyone else must sacrifice to pay for it. The question is no longer whether America can cut taxes without consequences. The consequences have arrived. Follow the money at langdon.substack.com.